genuine interaction. So there was that aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that, again, my view is, as I pointed in this book and in previous works, who gets sick and who doesn't isn't exactly accidental. There are certainly personality patterns based on traumatic experiences in childhood that make disease more likely. And people very often realize that throughout their lives, they had abandoned who they were. They lived a life that wasn't meaningful for them. And on death, they reconnected with themselves in an authentic way. And that seemed to be worth a lot to people. Again, I don't recommend that way of going, to reconnect with yourself, but people have I certainly saw it. So those are the two big lessons.
After your 33 years in medical practice, you described that you had a bit of you kind of tuned into a creative calling, which was writing.
Well, I began to write when I was a physician. So
Okay.
My first book on ADHD, after I was diagnosed with it, was published in 1999 now. So that was 23 years ago now. So I began to write. And even before then, I wrote, because I wrote columns for newspapers. But yes, there was a time in my life where the writing impulse, which had been with me all my life, was stifled and stymied. And so was I, because I had this frustration. In fact, I had this sense that there's something I needed to express, but I didn't know what and I didn't know how. And at some point I realized, oh yeah, I need to write. So that began before I finished medical practice, but it certainly has been essential to my ongoing unfolding as a human being.
I was so compelled by that when I read about that, because I've started to really understand the value of creativity in all of our lives, regardless of whether we have the luxury of being called an artist or not. Yeah. And so what, in your view, is the importance of
Well, you're singing my tune here, if I may say it that way, because I quote in this book, there's a great Hungarian-Canadian stress researcher called János Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, and Selye is the one who actually coined the word stress in the sense that we use it today. And he's the one that showed in the laboratory how stress diminishes the immune system and disorganizes the hormones and ulcerates the stomach and all this kind of stuff. But Selye also said, and I quote him here, what is in us must out. What is in us must out. That we all have to follow our creative urges in the way that nature prepared for us. Otherwise, we can be hopelessly hemmed in by frustration. I'm paraphrasing him very closely. So we are created in the image of God. I mean, as you know, what your religious views are, but that sense that we're created in the images of God means that we are creators, because the essence of God is creation. In fact, we call God the creator, and we call the result of that creation. If we're created and if we're offshoots of that creative dynamic in the universe, then it means that it's in us to create. And whatever form that takes, I mean, you don't want to see me do art, unless you... I can do a pretty good stick figure, but I'm married to an artist. So that creativity doesn't have to take the form of formal art, but it does have to take some flow of something that's inside you that needs to come out. Otherwise, as Selye says, you get hopelessly hemmed in by frustration. And so in that sense, everybody's got that creative urge, and that may take the form of social intercourse. It might take the form of gardening, I don't care, communing with nature, athletic expression, I don't care what. But there's everybody's got it. And if people don't realize they have it, it's only because life has hemmed them in and they're too busy. And sometimes they are trying to make a living or trying to survive or too disconnected from themselves. But it's in all of us. And to the extent that we don't give it expression, we suffer.
One of the things that really hems it in is the prospect that we might not be good at it, because we think to express ourselves creatively, we kind of join a competition of sorts. And that's a trap we can fall into. So if I'm going to DJ, I need to become a good DJ, but in social comparison, or else I don't want to. But what I've come to learn is, in fact, the act of DJing alone in my kitchen at midnight is the reward, regardless of outcome or whether there's a crowd there. If it's just me and my dog listening, Absolutely. That is the expression is the reward, not the achievement or the medal that I might get, or the
not the external. Well, look, I went through that in the writing of this book. So here I am, this writer who writes about trauma and healing, and all of a sudden I'm in a panic because I'm writing a book, and I realized that the problem was that you talked about identifying with your work. So I had identified with this book. So the problem wasn't the book. Because let's say I write the book and it's not a success. I mean, okay, big headline in the Sunday Times, book, not a big success. Like how big a big deal is that in the history of the universe? But if I identify with the book and it's not going well, then if the book fails, then I'm failing as a person, which then goes back to my very earliest concern about not being worth it, So once I disidentified, once I said, no, this is just a book. It may be a good book, it may be an important book, maybe a book that doesn't hit the mark, but it's only a book. And how it goes says nothing about me or my worth. Once I could decouple that, then I could confidently and much more comfortably go back to the writing of it. But I went through that crisis.
It seems like a bit of a paradox that the lack of self-worth would motivate someone to create great things because they want the approval, but at the same time make the process so agonizing because their self-esteem seems to be on the line.
Yeah.
Or their sense of self-worth is on the line.
Well, that dynamic was in me. Once I realized it, I let go of it. So it didn't dominate me in the end. And honest to God, by the time I finished the book, I'm not just saying this in retrospect. It's a bestseller now in several countries, but I actually said to myself, and I meant it, now I've done the book, that's what matters. I've said what was in me to say. How the world reacts, I can't control. And it doesn't actually matter. On a fundamental level, it's not that I don't want this book to be a success. I mean, success, of course I want it to sell 10 zillion copies, but that doesn't define my self-worth or how I function in the world or how I feel about myself. Honestly, it does not. And I understood that by the time I finished working on it. So once it's done, it's out there doing its work or not doing its work, but I don't have to hang my own sense of self on how the book does.
Because at that point, that's an outcome you can't control, right? So trying to control that would be anxiety and
yeah. Oh yeah, well, you can't control it, no.
10 years this book
Yeah.
took you to write.
Took me to prepare. It took about 3 years to write, yeah.
You describe it as a calling.
Yeah.
The myth of normal.
Yeah.
What 4 words to sort of pull people in and to in some way summarize a 550 odd page book. Mm-hmm. Why those 4 words? Why that phrase?
Can I pause for a moment to find a quote on my cell phone?
100%.
Yeah. 100%. So this is, are you familiar with the work of Eckhart Tolle?
Oh, Eckhart Tolle, yes.
Okay, yeah. So Tolle lives in Vancouver like I do. And in one of his books he says, the normal state of mind of most human beings contains a strong element of what we might call dysfunction or even madness, So in medical parlance, normal means healthy and natural. So there's a normal range of blood pressure, normal temperature. It's a range. Outside that range, there's no life. There's no health. Either too high or too low, you're gone. So normal means it's equivalent with, synonymous with healthy and natural. However, we make that same assumption that out in society, what we used to, what we call normal, is also healthy and natural, which is a myth. Because I'm saying that in this society, what we consider to be normal is neither healthy nor natural. In fact, it's hurtful to us. So that we're using the word normal in a way that doesn't apply. In a narrow medical sense, it's accurate, but in a broader sense, that which we're used to in this society, we consider normal, is just not good for us. And norm is kind of a statistic, or it's a kind of a average. So if everybody, you have a dog, if everybody in London mistreated their dogs, and if you didn't, then you'd be abnormal. So it's a myth to say that what is normal is healthy and natural. That's what I mean by the myth of normal. That's one thing I mean. The other thing I mean is, if we understand that the actual science of the unity of everything, I'm not talking about